If you ever come across children with pitch black eyes, don't trust them. Lock the door, and whatever you do, don't let them in. Welcome back to Dark Frontier. Black-eyed children are unsettling beings with glossy black eyes. They can be anywhere from 6 to 16, and some reports even suggest they have talons for feet. They seem to only ever want one thing: to be let in. One Texas man's puzzling 1996 encounter with these black-eyed children sparked a phenomenon in the canon of urban legends, with stories spanning across the US into England and beyond, of children with black eyes and unsettling dispositions. So what are these children really? Where are they from? And what happens if you let them in? While not the first ever encounter, the first well-documented case comes from the dusty West Texas town of Abilene, some 180 miles from Dallas. It was the summer of 1996. A man named Brian Bethel drove to Camelot Communications to pay his internet bill. There, in the neon light of the towering movie theater he was parked in front of, he was hunched over his steering wheel, writing his check. That's when there was a knock at his driver's side window. Rolling down his window, Brian expected to be conned into some shameless shakedown for change by a couple of local kids. He couldn't possibly have predicted what this encounter would mean. I was immediately gripped by an incomprehensible, soul-racking fear. I had no idea why. Brian recounted his story in the Abilene Reporter News in 2013, to coincide with the television debut of his tale on Destination America's Monsters and Mysteries in America program. Brian recounted his story to the Abilene Reporter News in 2013 to coincide with the television debut of his tale. After rolling down his window, fighting through the fear that gripped him, he observed the two children. One with olive skin and curly hair, the other a pale redhead with freckles. The curly-haired one, the spokesperson, as Brian described him, simply said that the two wanted to see the action film Mortal Kombat, but had left their money at home and needed a ride back to get it. Their story was plausible enough, Brian remembered, but through this entire exchange my fear grew. I had no reason to be frightened of these boys, but I was. Terribly. Brian weighed his options, stalling the conversation for as long as he could, hoping they would lose interest. After all, the last show of the night had already begun, and if Brian took them home and back, it would be a waste. They'd miss at least half of the film. He kept making excuses, and the curly-haired boy kept whispering strange assurances to him. It won't take long. We're just kids. We don't have any weapons. As the spokesperson attempted to coax Brian, his hand drifted to the lock on the car door. My mind exploded in a vortex of all-consuming terror, Brian said. Something had changed. He finally noticed their eyes, their coal-black eyes, like orbs of starless night. Panic gripped Brian as he began to roll up his window and put the car into drive. The spokesperson balled up his fist and banged against the glass, uttering something that would haunt Brian for the rest of his life.
We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in! Let us in!
The story spread online thanks to a small email list Brian had, focused on the paranormal. But Brian soon found out that he wasn't alone, not by a long shot. North Carolina, 2009. The US Marines are considered one of the most elite military forces in the world, facing threats from across the globe. But according to one Marine from Camp Lejeune, it seems like even the devil dogs draw the line at black-eyed children. In 2014, a Marine going by the online name Reaper31 submitted his story to Live About, a journal site that chronicles stories of the unexplained. This Marine was on base during a particularly quiet weekend in 2009. when everyone else was off enjoying their weekend. While watching a movie, he heard a knock at the door. According to his account, he figured it was his drunken roommate who'd probably lost his keys again. Instead, this soldier came face to face with something unnerving. "I found 2 little kids standing on the walkway. Only these kids freaked the hell out of me. I don't know what it was about them, but as a Marine, we're always told to listen to that little voice in your head, because it might just save your life from an IED. Right then, that voice was screaming at me to shut the door and lock it." The children, he recalled, had pitch black eyes. But the young Marine looked past that, asking them what they were doing there so late, and how they even got into the guarded barracks. The children said they were cold and wanted to come in and read. They were inching closer now, and the Marine's dread slowly turned into outright terror. "I was frightened and immediately shut the door." They began to rattle the doorknob, continuing to knock. The windows began to shake, and the man grew more and more terrified, nearly breaking out into full-blown panic until it stopped. It just stopped. All of it stopped. The children were gone, vanished into the dark unknown of the night, just as mysteriously as they'd appeared. You shouldn't open the door for kids with black eyes, but you should open the door to Dark Frontier by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. You never know what we'll bring to your door next. Ohio, 2010. This Ohio man's tale was submitted to the paranormal blog site From the Shadows, which publishes curated first-hand accounts of the unknown, curated by Northwest Missouri State University professor Jason Offutt, going by the name Noetic to preserve his anonymity. This man's story begins July 10, 2010, at an undisclosed data center where he worked on the weekends. Around 5 in the morning, roughly halfway through his shift, he stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. He says he was used to seeing people through the night. There is a bar and a small plaza directly to the right of our building, and a small apartment complex across the street. So it's not out of character to see someone walking through our lot, going to the bar, or crossing the street to get to the apartment. But again, it was 5 a.m. now. That's when he saw them. 2 teenage boys, 14 and 16 he guessed, standing in the plaza parking lot. Immediately they unnerved him. "They just stared me down," Noetic said. "But maybe I startled them first? It was 5 in the morning, and I just stepped out of nowhere to smoke." Finishing his cigarette just as the birds began to sing, he thought nothing else of the children as he went back inside. Sitting down at his desk, the intercom to the building starts to ring. Strange. He checks the camera feed and he sees those kids. Buzzing Noetic again, the older one beckoned him to come down. Noetic told them he didn't have time for games and for them to leave. But they didn't. They were just getting started. They buzzed again and again. Finally, having had enough, Noetic went down to confront them and shoo them away before threatening to call the police. The glass in the lobby is one way. I could see out, but no one could see in. That's when I noticed their eyes. Deep, completely black. I felt like they were watching me. He opened the door and told the kids to get lost or the cops would be called. But they weren't fazed. One kid looked at me and said, "That won't be necessary, sir. We need to use your phone. Can you let us in?" He told them he didn't let anyone in. That's when their manner changed, from calm, albeit bizarre, to something else entirely. The one I was talking to didn't like that one bit. He told me, "No, you will invite us in," while the other kid had this menacing grin on his face. Feeling threatened, Noetic shut the door and returned to his office. The kids now separated and stood in front of the cameras outside, staring up, seemingly straight through the lens. Trying to get back to work, Noetic kept an eye on them through the camera feeds, which allowed him to see all around the building's exterior. Then, eyes scanning for them, he realized they were gone. They'd slipped into the camera's blind spots and disappeared. Even if they were out there hiding in the blind spot, Noetic wasn't going back down to find out. A quick stop at the mall was all college student Carrie Kisner had on her mind one day in 2012, as she was coming home from her classes at Wake Tech Community College in Raleigh. After a sprint through the Triangle Town Center Mall, she returned to her car with her bags and saw one of these black-eyed children for herself. An older woman was hunched over, digging around in her bag, looking for something, as if looking for something to give this boy that Carrie guessed was around 12. I'd never seen anyone like him, she told the website Mysterious Universe. He stood very rigid with his hands by his sides, looking at the ground as she fished around in her purse for something to give him. As I got closer, I noticed he seemed to get more and more uncomfortable. The boy began to shift his posture when Kisner passed him on the way to her car. Then he lifted his head and made eye contact with her. I froze. His eyes were black as night, very dull, almost dead. The look he gave me has haunted me. The feeling I got from him was as though he wasn't all there, almost ghostly. Carrie jumped in her car as fast as she could and returned home, but said the memory of that boy has haunted her ever since. Reports of puzzling and hair-raising encounters with these children continue sporadically across Louisiana, Massachusetts, and Nevada. But one 2012 report may prove to be the most puzzling of all. Website Mysterious Universe recounted a story from a woman named Esme in Bristol, England, who took a walk with her boyfriend one morning after a night of heavy storms. Taking their dog through a secluded path along a raised river, Esme spotted a group of these black-eyed people who, to Esme, looked completely normal. A bit too normal. Like she was hypnotized, Esme said. This strange group was dressed in wet weather clothes, including coats and boots, but the woman was dressed in normal pumps, street clothes. She didn't belong there. 1 year later, Esme's boyfriend would return to the river adjacent to the quiet little path, where they had encountered the black-eyed children and the out-of-place woman. There he would drown, trying to save a girl named Sally that he cried for between throes of splashing and coughing. She was there and he wouldn't rest until he'd saved her, but locals that came to help realized he was talking to himself. There was no one else there. There was no Sally, and Esme would later report that her boyfriend had never known or mentioned anyone by that name. Esme would go on to swear that it was those black-eyed strangers who had implanted this curse or vision in her lover's brain. After the authorities would chalk the death up to a drug-induced mania. Was the girl they'd passed in the park 1 year before Sally? Was she a captive of these black-eyed specters? Or was she something else? These reports of run-ins with the black-eyed children are eyebrow-raising, but there's something even more alarming. What happens if you do let them in? To explore the possible origins of these black-eyed children is to journey ever deeper into the dark frontier itself, into mythical beings, the terrors of our world, and perhaps as far back as the dawn of creation. So, until next time, lock your doors and roll up your windows, because there are still plenty of reasons to be afraid of the dark.